The golden glow of a California evening washed over the glass facade of Redwood Civic Hall in Santa Clara, a city that once symbolized the optimism of American innovation, and tonight stood at the crossroads of its cultural identity. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Rows of polished wood seats, filled with Americans from all walks of life, faced a grand debate stage flanked by towering LED screens. In living rooms across the nation, millions of viewers, many who had lived through civil rights marches, Vietnam protests, and the Reagan Revolution, leaned forward in their chairs. They weren't just tuning in for another talking head debate. They were witnessing a confrontation between two Americas. At center stage stood Cheryl Sarkisian, a name etched into the soundtrack of the boomer generation. With her signature voice and fierce advocacy, Cheryl had long been a beacon of rebellion against authority, a living testament to the era when music and activism intertwined to shape national identity. To many watching, she wasn't just a performer, she was a symbol of youthful fire, a reminder of when ideals seemed powerful enough to shake the world. The night, dressed in flowing black with silver accents, she looked every bit the icon she had become, ready to defend the progressive ideals she spent decades championing. Across from her stood Karoline Leavitt, young, composed, and almost startling in her quiet confidence. As the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, Karoline embodied a new, less sentimental generation, one that didn't inherit the optimism of the '60s, but the bruises of the 2008 financial collapse, endless wars, and a country in cultural freefall. Her navy blue suit was simple but sharp, her expression steady. She was not here to perform. She was here to recalibrate a national conversation that many believed had been led astray by Hollywood's fading grandeur. The cameras panned between the two figures as the host, Darren Vance, a veteran journalist with a gravelly voice, stepped into the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pausing with a gravitas that made the room hold its breath, "tonight, we don't just discuss policies. We discuss who shapes the future, those who gave voice to a generation, or those who now seek to lead the next." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Some clutched programs with Cheryl's name printed proudly. Others watched Karoline, sensing something unfamiliar yet undeniable. This wasn't a battle of celebrity. It wasn't even a battle of ideology. It was a generational reckoning. The cheers, the doubts, the silent judgments, all collided under the Civic Hall's vaulted ceiling as Darren continued. Two voices, two visions, one nation watching. The stage lights dimmed slightly. The opening theme faded out. Microphones were tested one last time. Then, silence, charged and electric, as Cheryl Sarkisian and Karoline Leavitt locked eyes across the stage. The battle for America's cultural soul had begun. As the moderator's voice faded, a new energy swept across the hall, the kind that only comes when history steps forward to defend itself. Cheryl Sarkisian lifted her microphone, her hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. She didn't rush. Instead, she let the weight of her presence settle in the room like a familiar melody from decades past. When she finally spoke, her voice carried that unmistakable richness, equal parts resilience, passion, and pain. "I have seen this country through some of its darkest nights," Cheryl began, her tone weaving between storyteller and witness. "I marched when it wasn't safe. I sang when it wasn't popular. I fought for those without a voice when it cost me fans, friends, and fame." Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience, many of whom could still remember black and white footage of civil rights marches or anti-war protests on their television screens. She paced slowly across the stage, her silver jewelry catching the soft lights like the glint of a battle-worn sword. "I know what it means to dream about an America that could be better," she said. "And I know what it costs to keep that dream alive." Her eyes scanned the audience, an audience that once upon a time had made her an icon. A few nodded, remembering a younger Cheryl standing against presidents, against wars, against silence. Turning slightly toward the cameras, Cheryl's voice grew more impassioned. Today we are told that protecting our borders justifies ripping apart families, that tariffs crushing working-class families are somehow patriotic, that if you question authority you are somehow un-American. Her words, sharp and deliberate, cut into the crowd's collective conscience. But I remember an America where compassion wasn't weakness, where standing up to injustice was the highest form of patriotism. The hall filled with tentative applause, especially from those who longed for the moral clarity of past struggles. Cheryl leaned into the emotion, telling vivid stories of families she had met. Immigrants clinging to hope, single mothers burdened by rising costs, factory workers abandoned by broken promises. Each word seemed sculpted to remind her listeners that the fight for justice was not theoretical. It had faces, names, broken hearts. And yet, she continued, her voice lowering into a tone of weary sadness, some would have you believe that cruelty is strength, that the American dream belongs to some but not all, that power must come at the cost of our humanity. She paused, the silence heavy, then concluded, if that's the future, I refuse to stand by quietly. A strong wave of applause surged through the hall, accompanied by a few standing ovations. Cameras panned over tear-streaked faces, graying veterans, former activists, and middle-aged teachers, all those who remembered fighting for a better world. Cheryl had wrapped herself in the flag of memory, calling not only on political ideals but on personal, living history. The moderator, sensing the peak of emotion, let the moment breathe. Then, with a measured tone, he pivoted. Cheryl Sarkisian reminds us of the heart behind the American dream. But tonight we also ask, can heart alone carry us forward? Karoline Leavitt, the floor is yours. The stage shifted, the applause slowly faded, and all eyes turned to Karoline, young, unshaken, waiting not to mourn the past, but to challenge it. As the last echoes of applause faded into a heavy silence, Karoline Leavitt rose to her feet with a composed energy that felt almost unnatural in the emotionally charged room. She didn't gesture wildly or raise her voice. Instead, she approached her microphone with the precision of someone who understood that in a storm of sentiment, the stillest figure commands the most attention. Dressed in crisp navy and with a stack of neatly organized notes before her, notes she scarcely needed to glance at, Karoline looked not like a politician desperate for approval, but like a steward of facts and responsibility. Miss Sarkisian's passion is undeniable, Karoline began, her voice clear, steady, and sharp, and I deeply respect the battles she has fought. But America cannot be led by emotion alone. Dreams, however beautiful, must be built on the foundation of law, order, and fairness, or they crumble. Her words fell like stones into a pool of charged air, sending ripples across the hall. Some in the crowd stiffened, unsure whether to clap or bristle, but Karoline pressed on, undeterred. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if speaking not at the audience but directly to them. Immigration is not and never has been about cruelty. It's about protecting the dignity of the American worker, the single mother in Ohio, the factory foreman in Michigan, the family farmer in Iowa, who have watched their jobs, wages, and futures erode under the weight of unchecked policies. She paused just long enough for the reality to sink in. Without secure borders, there is no secure economy. Without fair laws, there is no fairness for those who follow them. A few muted claps came from the audience, scattered, uncertain, but Karoline had only just begun. She moved seamlessly into real examples, statistics about wage suppression in key industries, spikes in fentanyl trafficking at unsecured crossings, the silent suffering of blue-collar towns forgotten by a media obsessed with glamour. It wasn't anger that powered her argument, it was clarity. I'm not here to diminish anyone's dreams, Karoline continued, her voice warming slightly. I'm here to defend the dreams of Americans who've played by the rules, who've raised families, who've paid taxes, who've built communities, and who deserve a government that fights for them too. Her words touched a deeper chord now, especially with the older audience members who had lived through economic booms and busts, watched factories close and seen towns hollowed out. The camera cut to Cheryl, who shifted slightly in her seat, her earlier emotional crescendo now meeting a rising tide of cold, hard facts. Karoline stood firm, an immovable force against a sea of sentimentality. She wasn't rude, she wasn't disrespectful, but she refused to concede the moral high ground simply because her argument was wrapped not in song, but in numbers and principle. As she concluded her first remarks, Karoline delivered the line that would echo far beyond the Civic Hall that night. Compassion without order is chaos, and dreams without responsibility are nothing more than wishes. A low, growing rumble of applause followed, stronger this time. The camera panned over older audience members nodding thoughtfully, some leaning forward, others folding arms with a silent approval that spoke louder than cheers. The moderator, ever the craftsman of tension, allowed the applause to settle before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard two visions, one of boundless dreams, one of measured stewardship. Now, we turn to the American worker, tariffs, and the true price of protecting our industries. Stay with us. The lights shifted slightly. The stakes rose again. And Karoline, having weathered the first storm, stood ready, not just to defend, but to lead. The moderator's voice returned, cutting through the momentary calm with a precision that reignited the tension. Now, he said, we turn from immigration to economics, the impact of tariffs on American families. Ms. Sarkisian, you've argued that tariffs are a burden crushing the working class. Would you care to elaborate? The camera swung to Cheryl Sarkisian, who rose with a practiced elegance, her hand gripping the microphone like a torch. With the practiced cadence of a performer, Cheryl launched into her next salvo. These tariffs aren't saving America, they're strangling it, she said, her voice swelling with conviction. Families across this country, good, hard-working families, are paying more for everything: milk, bread, school supplies. You don't rebuild an economy by making it harder to put food on the table. Her words, tinged with a raw urgency, drew scattered applause from pockets of the audience, sympathetic to her plea. Cheryl pressed forward, painting vivid scenes of grocery store shelves where prices seemed to climb overnight, of small businesses buckling under rising costs. She spoke of single mothers counting every penny, veterans on fixed incomes watching their grocery bills balloon. Her voice, at times cracking with intensity, struck an emotional nerve among many older viewers who knew what it meant to stretch a dollar thin. She ended her appeal with a dramatic flourish. We are taxing the very people we claim to fight for. A wave of applause rolled across the room, but it wasn't the thunderous ovation Cheryl had commanded earlier. There was hesitation now, a restlessness that Karoline Leavitt immediately recognized as opportunity. Standing slowly, Karoline didn't rush to counter. She waited, letting the emotional fog settle just enough for facts to find oxygen. Cheryl speaks passionately about struggle, Karoline began, her tone measured but firm. But passion does not change the truth. She paused, locking eyes with several members of the audience before continuing. Tariffs are not about hurting American families. They are about protecting them. About protecting the industries that once made this country the envy of the world. The steel mills, the auto factories, the supply chains that made Made in America a badge of honor, not a memory. Karoline moved closer to the edge of the stage, speaking directly to the audience now, not at them. When we allowed cheap foreign imports to flood our markets unchecked, we didn't just lose products. We lost communities. We lost main streets. We lost entire ways of life. Tariffs are a hard medicine, yes, but sometimes you need tough treatment to heal a deep wound. The audience grew quieter, more attentive. Karoline pulled out cold, irrefutable numbers. Since the implementation of tariffs, over 35,000 jobs had returned to manufacturing hubs in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Steel production was rebounding. Communities once teetering on the edge of collapse were finding their footing again. Tariffs are not a tax on dreams, she continued, her voice gaining strength. They are an investment in the American worker. The welder in Youngstown, the machinist in Detroit, the farmer in Iowa who finally sees fair prices again. The moderator interjected sharply, sensing the rising energy. But, Karoline, what about the immediate hardships? Higher prices at the grocery store, rising costs for consumers. Isn't that a heavy price for patriotism? Without missing a beat, Karoline responded with the clarity of someone who had prepared for this exact moment. Short-term pain for long-term gain is not a new idea to Americans, she said. Our parents and grandparents rationed during wars. They sacrificed for a future they might never even see, and because they did, we inherited a country worth fighting for. The camera cut to the audience, gray-haired veterans nodding silently, couples exchanging thoughtful glances. Karoline pressed on, today, standing up to China's unfair trade practices, bringing our supply chains home, and restoring dignity to American labor isn't a burden, it's our generation's duty. It's how we honor the sacrifices that built this nation in the first place. A fresh wave of applause burst forth, louder, fuller this time. Some even stood. It wasn't raucous or wild, it was the applause of people who had heard something they recognized as truth. Across the stage, Cheryl shifted uneasily, adjusting her microphone. Emotion had carried her opening argument, but now the weight of facts and of lived experience was tilting the room toward Karoline. The moderator allowed a beat of silence before moving on, his voice grave. As we move forward tonight, we ask, what matters more, comfort in the moment or strength for the future? The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown between two very different visions of America. The moderator's voice cut through the applause, steady and almost somber. Before we proceed to broader topics, he said, glancing at his notes, we must address a matter that speaks not only to policies, but to promises. A ripple of tension moved through the room. He turned toward Cheryl Sarkisian, his tone carefully neutral, but unmistakably pointed. Ms. Sarkisian, in 2016 you publicly stated that if Donald Trump won the presidency, you would leave America, yet you chose to stay. Many viewed that vow not as mere hyperbole, but as a solemn commitment. Would you care to explain your decision? A flicker crossed Cheryl's face, defiance mixed with a strain of discomfort, but she seized the microphone with the practiced instinct of a lifelong performer. Yes, I said those words, she admitted, her voice strong, though tinged with defensiveness. But I stayed because I love this country. I stayed to fight for what's right, to be a voice for those hurt by his policies. Leaving would have been surrender, and I don't surrender. The audience responded with polite, cautious applause, but it lacked the thunderous certainty of before. A few skeptics shook their heads. A tension hung thickly now, the uncomfortable realization that in politics, as in life, words matter. Karoline Leavitt did not rush her response. She stood, straightened her notes, and approached her microphone with a surgeon's calm. Respectfully, she began, her voice clear as a bell. There is a difference between passion and accountability. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. When public figures make promises, especially promises as dramatic and public as leaving the country, they aren't just speaking into the void. They are speaking to the hopes, fears, and trust of millions of Americans. The room grew stiller, as if even the oxygen had thickened. Karoline's gaze, steady and unflinching, never wavered from Cheryl. You made a vow when it suited the moment, and when the moment passed, so did your conviction. That's not resistance, that's performance. A collective murmur rippled through the hall. An involuntary reaction to a blow that landed squarely where it hurt most. Credibility. Moving methodically, Karoline built her case further, speaking not in anger but in measured, cutting precision. Trust, she said, is not built on feelings, it is built on actions. When you told Americans you would leave and didn't, you told them, whether you intended to or not, that your words are negotiable, that your promises can be abandoned when inconvenient. And if we can't trust the promises of our leaders, what can we trust? Cheryl tried to interject, but the moderator, sensing the seismic shift, held her back with a simple raised hand, giving Karoline the space to finish. And tonight, Karoline concluded, her voice firm but not cruel, we are not just debating policies. We are debating what kind of leadership this country deserves. Leadership that seeks applause or leadership that keeps its word. A long, heavy silence filled the Civic Hall. Then, slowly, like the first roll of distant thunder, applause began, building, strengthening, until it roared into a full standing ovation from sections of the audience. Some sat thoughtfully, others clapped fervently, but all knew something critical had shifted. This wasn't just a clash of ideas anymore. It had become a reckoning of character. Cheryl adjusted the microphone with visible tension, her earlier aura of righteous defiance dimmed by the hard, unyielding light of broken promises. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was smaller somehow. "I stayed to fight," she said again, but it sounded less like a declaration and more like an excuse. Drifting into the charged silence, the moderator's voice, crisp and final, closed the segment with gravity. "Tonight we are reminded. Promises are the currency of public trust. Spend them carelessly, and the debt will come due." The lights shifted slightly, preparing the stage for the next chapter of the battle. But everyone watching, in the hall and across the country, knew the momentum had already begun to tip. The moderator let the room breathe, giving the audience a few precious moments to absorb the seismic shift that had just occurred. Then, with a deft hand, he steered the conversation into even deeper waters. "We've spoken about trust," he said, "but now we ask, who truly speaks for the American people today?" His voice carried the weight of a challenge, not just to the debaters on stage, but to every person watching across the country. Cheryl Sarkisian was quick to seize the moment. Rising to her feet, she gathered the remnants of her wounded pride and forged them into renewed passion. "I have spent my life fighting for women, for minorities, for the LGBTQ community," she declared, her voice ringing out like an anthem from a protest stage. "I've sung for change, marched for justice, and spoken out when others stayed silent." Her words soared, invoking decades of battles fought and in many ways won. She turned toward the audience, her silver-streaked hair catching the stage lights. "I have been a voice for those without a platform. I have used my fame not for wealth or privilege, but to speak truth to power." A scattering of applause followed, loyal but less certain than before. For a moment, it seemed as if Cheryl might recapture the narrative, rekindle the old magic that once moved crowds to tears. But when Karoline Leavitt rose, she did not come with a louder voice. She came with something far more potent: reality. "I honor the legacy Miss Sarkisian speaks of," Karoline began, her voice calm but edged with steel. "But America does not live in memories. It lives in the here and now. And today's American worker, today's struggling family, today's young graduate drowning in uncertainty, they are not looking for anthems. They are looking for answers." The hall stilled. Karoline stepped forward, bridging the gap between stage and seats, not with grandiosity, but with the plain-spoken gravity of someone who had walked through the same America her audience knew, the one beyond coastal elites, beyond red carpets, beyond well-crafted Twitter posts. "You say you speak for the people," Karoline continued, "but what people? Hollywood? The gated communities of Los Angeles? The social media circles where the only voices heard are those that already agree with you?" She paused, not for drama, but to let truth sink its teeth in. Across the screen, viewers at home, farmers, truck drivers, retired teachers, veterans, leaned forward. Caroline's voice rose, not in volume but in conviction. "The people I speak for are the ones forgotten by the cities you tour in limousines, the ones who don't have publicists or press agents, the ones who work double shifts to make a mortgage payment while the media calls them backward, bigoted, and expendable." A soft murmur of agreement moved through the Civic Hall, growing stronger with each breath. It wasn't a flashy rebellion, it was a quiet uprising of common sense, of lived experience, of those who had long felt spoken down to by the very celebrities who claimed to represent them. Cheryl, sensing her grasp on the room slipping further, tried to interject with a defense of cultural activism, but the moderator raised a calming hand. The moment belonged to Karoline now. Closing her argument, Karoline delivered the blow that would define the night. The people don't need another voice singing over them. They need leaders willing to walk among them, and no song, no matter how beautiful, can substitute for the truth. Applause erupted again, louder, fuller, less restrained than before. The camera caught glimpses of weathered hands clapping, of faces lined with years of work and worry, now lit with something rare: hope. The divide was no longer merely ideological, it was generational, cultural, spiritual. It was the difference between living for applause and living for purpose. And tonight, it was clear, the future belonged not to the performers, but to those ready to rebuild. For a moment, the stage was suspended between two Americas, one clinging to familiar songs of the past, the other straining toward something more grounded, more tangible. The moderator, sensing the shift, leaned into his microphone. His voice, lower and more deliberate now, posed the final question that would determine the night's victor. Tonight we've heard passion, we've heard policy, but what separates a performance from a promise kept? Miss Sarkisian, Miss Leavitt, what does real leadership mean to you? Cheryl Sarkisian was the first to respond. She stood with the proud posture of a warrior from an earlier age. Leadership, she said, voice swelling like the final chorus of a ballad, is having the courage to stand against injustice no matter the cost, to fight for the voiceless, to speak even when others tell you to stay silent. Her words were stirring, almost musical in their cadence. She ended with a passionate plea, her voice catching slightly, "I will never stop fighting for what's right, no matter who stands against me." There was respectful applause. But it was different now, polite, fading before it truly rose. Then Karoline Leavitt stepped forward, without notes, without theatrics, just her voice, steady as iron. "Leadership," she said, "is not about how loudly you sing, it's about how faithfully you serve." The hall and millions watching at home fell into an attentive hush. Karoline continued, her tone like a chisel against marble. Real leadership is not performance. It's not grand speeches when cameras are rolling or dramatic vows made for applause. It's what you do when no one's watching. It's the promises you keep when they're no longer convenient. It's the truth you live out, not the slogans you wear when it's fashionable. Her gaze, unwavering, met Cheryl's across the stage. "You say you fight for the people," Karoline said, her voice soft but cutting. "But when the storms came, you stayed comfortable while they weathered it alone. You sang from mansions while their factories closed. You promised to stand with them, but you stood above them." There was no anger in her delivery, only a devastating, quiet finality. Karoline took a single step forward, as if bridging not just the physical space but the gap between forgotten Americans and the leaders who once claimed them. "True leadership," she concluded, "is sacrifice without spotlight, loyalty without applause, truth without performance. And America deserves nothing less." The Civic Hall exploded into the loudest applause of the night, not just from supporters but from many who had come unsure, even skeptical. Some rose to their feet. Others wiped at eyes that had seen decades of broken promises and now, perhaps, glimpsed something different. Cheryl stood motionless, a defiant smile frozen on her face, but the moment had passed her by. The room, and the country watching beyond it, had already turned drawn, not to nostalgia, but to something real, something they hadn't felt from a public figure in far too long. Conviction without performance. The moderator gave a knowing nod and spoke only one line to close the segment. "Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, the truth spoke, and America listened." The closing music of America Unfiltered played softly in the background as the credits rolled, but inside Redwood Civic Hall, no one was rushing for the exits. The air was thick with something heavier than mere applause. It was the quiet, stunned realization that something fundamental had just shifted. Attendees lingered in their seats, murmuring in low tones, casting glances toward the stage where Karoline Leavitt had just finished delivering a masterclass in conviction, precision, and calm dominance. Backstage, media teams scrambled like a swarm of bees. Phones buzzed violently as social media clips of Karoline's dismantling of the old guard flooded onto TikTok, X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook. Headlines were already beginning to appear online. The night the curtain fell on celebrity politics, Karoline Leavitt, the calm that shattered the noise. A new standard for leadership emerges. On television screens across the country, pundits scrambled to pivot. Conservative commentators hailed Karoline's performance as a defining moment for a new generation of public servants, one not built on slogans or celebrity endorsements, but on principle. Even neutral and liberal-leaning analysts conceded that something undeniable had taken place. Cheryl Sarkisian, once untouchable in her cultural stature, found herself portrayed not as a triumphant activist, but as a relic of a bygone era, an artist out of step with the very people she once claimed to champion. The real pulse, however, wasn't in the studios or among media elites. It was in the living rooms of Middle America. Veterans halls, small-town diners, church basements, places that rarely hosted political debates, but tonight buzzed with fresh conversation. Older Americans who had weathered recessions, fought in wars, and seen promises broken too many times recognized in Karoline a reflection of values they feared were slipping away: duty, honesty, and resilience. Karoline's viral quote, "Leadership is sacrifice without spotlight, loyalty without applause, truth without performance," spread like wildfire across every platform, becoming a rallying cry for a public exhausted by spectacle and yearning for substance. Meanwhile, Cheryl's attempts to recapture the narrative rang hollow. She posted an Instagram story late that night thanking her fans, insisting she would keep fighting for justice, but the comments were divided. Longtime fans still praised her legacy, but many younger commenters, and even some her own age, expressed disillusionment, questioning whether fame and activism had become too intertwined to trust. Inside the Civic Hall, as Karoline exited the stage, she didn't pause for cameras or grand gestures. She gave a few firm handshakes to supporters, exchanged a quiet word with her staff, and disappeared into the wings, leaving behind the image of a leader who didn't need the spotlight to validate her impact. Across America, one truth became evident. The debate hadn't just been won on points, it had been won on character. The generation that had once followed songs of protest now found itself quietly nodding along to something rarer: a voice of stewardship, not spectacle. And though the debate had ended, the shift it triggered was just beginning to reshape the American political and cultural landscape. As the night deepened and the lights of Santa Clara dimmed, a quiet reckoning swept across the country. In homes where veterans' portraits lined the walls, in town halls where faded American flags still hung proudly, in small cafes where old friends gathered over black coffee, people were talking. But they weren't just discussing sound bites or who won the debate. They were speaking about something deeper, something almost forgotten in an era of flashing headlines and celebrity outrage: the return of dignity, clarity, and principle to public life. America had seen a clash, but it wasn't merely between a celebrity and a political rising star. It was a collision between two ways of living, one that thrived on appearances, applause, and momentary performances, and another that stood grounded in service, truth, and sacrifice. Karoline Leavitt hadn't just countered Cheryl Sarkisian's points, she had reminded a weary nation what real leadership looks like: calm under fire, firm without cruelty, unshakable without arrogance. For the generation that tuned in hoping to see reason win over noise, it was a rare and welcome sight. They saw in Karoline not the arrogance of youth, but the strength of preparation, not the recklessness of rebellion, but the resolve of stewardship. She didn't sing over America's problems, she spoke through them, with facts, respect, and a deep reverence for the hard work and sacrifices that built the country in the first place. Cheryl Sarkisian remained a towering figure in the eyes of many, her songs and past activism having once stirred millions. But tonight, something was undeniably clear: the cultural currency she once spent so freely had depreciated, emotion without follow-through, promises without accountability, fame without roots. For the first time, the American public saw the glittering veneer peel back, and they chose differently. Karoline's viral words echoed across social platforms and AM radio alike. Truth doesn't need applause to endure, it needs only courage to be spoken. For an audience that had lived through times when words were sacred and actions spoke louder than protests, Karoline's message felt less like a campaign and more like a calling back to first principles. Duty over popularity, service over spectacle, truth over trends. In a fractured and weary America, it was a glimpse of what many feared had been lost, and what perhaps could still be restored. As the credits faded and living rooms grew quiet, one enduring truth settled into the national consciousness. Real leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one who, even in the storm, refuses to let go of the compass. Tonight, America didn't just watch a debate. It watched the beginning of a new chapter, and perhaps the return of something it had almost forgotten it could believe in.